Question 1. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of activity within HELA operations that could potentially indicate a breach of data privacy regulations. Which of the following actions best aligns with the regulatory framework and ethical responsibilities for HELA? Option A. Immediately escalate the findings to the relevant regulatory authority without further internal review. Option B. Ignore the monitoring system's output, assuming it is a false positive, to avoid unnecessary internal disruption. Option C. Conduct a detailed internal investigation to assess the nature and extent of the potential breach, consulting relevant internal policies and regulatory guidelines before determining the next steps. Option D. Implement a broad, immediate change to operational procedures across all departments to prevent any future similar activity, without fully understanding the specific cause. Correct answer is A. Immediately escalate the findings to the relevant regulatory authority without further internal review. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at HELA to interpret and act upon data from a monitoring system that may indicate potential noncompliance with regulatory requirements. The challenge lies in accurately identifying the nature of the issue, understanding the relevant regulatory framework, and selecting the most appropriate course of action to mitigate risk and ensure adherence to legal and ethical standards. Careful judgment is required to avoid overreacting or underreacting, both of which could have significant consequences for HELA. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the monitoring system's output against the specific regulatory framework applicable to HELA operations. This means understanding the nuances of the relevant laws and guidelines, assessing whether the observed data truly constitutes a breach, and then initiating the appropriate internal procedures for investigation and remediation. This approach is correct because it prioritizes compliance, risk management, and due diligence, aligning with the principles of responsible corporate conduct and the specific mandates of the HELA hiring assessment test's regulatory jurisdiction. It ensures that any actions taken are informed, proportionate, and legally sound. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the monitoring system's findings without proper investigation. This is a regulatory failure because it demonstrates a disregard for potential compliance issues and a lack of proactive risk management. It could lead to undetected violations, resulting in penalties, reputational damage, and legal liabilities for HELA. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately escalate the issue to external authorities without internal assessment or consultation. This could be an ethical failure if it bypasses established internal reporting and resolution mechanisms, potentially causing unnecessary alarm or reputational harm to HELA. And it might also be a regulatory failure if it contravenes specific reporting timelines or procedures. A further incorrect approach would be to implement a superficial fix without understanding the root cause of the potential noncompliance. This is a failure in professional judgment and a potential regulatory risk, as it does not address the underlying issue and may lead to recurring problems. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process when faced with such situations. This involves 1. Understanding the data and its potential implications. 2. Identifying the relevant regulatory framework and specific requirements. 3. Conducting a preliminary assessment to determine if a breach has likely occurred. 4. Following established internal protocols for reporting and investigation. 5. Consulting with relevant internal departments e.g. legal compliance as needed. And 6. Implementing appropriate corrective actions based on a thorough understanding of the issue and regulatory guidance. Question 2. Operational review demonstrates that HELA current candidate screening process for the HELA hiring assessment test includes a preliminary assessment of social media profiles for all applicants. This practice has been in place for several years and is considered efficient by the hiring managers. However, the compliance team is unsure if this aligns with the specific regulatory framework governing the HELA hiring assessment test. Which of the following actions should HELA compliance team prioritize? Option A. Request a formal opinion from the hiring managers on the necessity of social media screening and proceed based on their consensus without direct reference to the HELA hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. Option B. Continue the social media screening practice as it is an established internal process and assume it complies with the HELA hiring assessment test's regulatory framework unless explicitly prohibited. Option C. Consult with HR managers to understand the perceived benefits of social media screening and update internal policies to reflect these benefits, assuming regulatory compliance. Option D. Immediately cease the social media screening practice to avoid any potential regulatory violations, and conduct a thorough review of the HELA hiring assessment test's regulatory framework to determine permissible screening methods. Correct answer is D. Immediately cease the social media screening practice to avoid any potential regulatory violations, and conduct a thorough review of the HELA hiring assessment test's regulatory framework to determine permissible screening methods. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires HELA compliance team to navigate potential conflicts between internal company policies and external regulatory requirements, specifically within the framework of the HELA hiring assessment test's jurisdiction. The core challenge lies in ensuring that any proposed action taken by HELA is not only operationally efficient, but also strictly adheres to the established legal and ethical standards governing hiring practices. Careful judgment is required to avoid actions that could lead to legal repercussions, reputational damage, or unfair treatment of candidates. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the HELA hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework to determine if the observed operational practice aligns with its mandates. This approach is right because it prioritizes compliance with the governing regulations. By consulting the specific laws and guidelines applicable to the HELA hiring assessment test, the compliance team can definitively ascertain whether the operational review's findings indicate a breach or a permissible practice. This ensures that HELA hiring processes are legally sound and ethically defensible, safeguarding the company and its candidates. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a common industry practice or an internal HELA policy, not explicitly validated against the HELA hiring assessment test's regulatory framework, is acceptable. This is a regulatory failure because it bypasses the primary source of authority for hiring practices within the context of this assessment. Relying on assumptions or less authoritative internal guidelines without cross-referencing the specific regulatory framework risks noncompliance. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the operational review's findings without a proper investigation into their regulatory implications. This is an ethical failure as it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a potential disregard for fair hiring practices, which are often underpinned by regulatory requirements. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a hierarchical approach to compliance. First, identify the specific regulatory framework governing the situation, in this case, the HELA hiring assessment test's jurisdiction. Second, analyze the operational findings against this framework. Third, if discrepancies or potential issues are identified, consult with legal counsel or compliance experts specializing in that jurisdiction. Fourth, implement corrective actions that are fully compliant with the regulatory requirements and document the process thoroughly. Question 3. Upon reviewing a proposed partnership agreement for HELA that could significantly impact market share in a specific automotive component sector, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with relevant competition laws and ethical business practices? Option A. Immediately consult HELA legal and compliance departments to thoroughly review the agreement for any potential anti-competitive clauses or conflicts of interest and seek their formal approval before proceeding. Option B. Implement the partnership and address any potential regulatory concerns only if they arise after the agreement is finalized. Option C. Proceed with the partnership after a brief internal discussion, assuming the terms are standard and beneficial to HELA. Option D. Inform the potential partner that HELA is open to the agreement but will not be seeking external legal or compliance review, as it would slow down the process. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the partnership after a brief internal discussion, assuming the terms are standard and beneficial to HELA. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure that HELA business practices align with regulatory expectations regarding fair competition and market integrity. The core of the challenge lies in maintaining objectivity and avoiding actions that could be perceived as anti-competitive or exploitative, even if seemingly beneficial in the short term. Careful judgment is required to uphold ethical standards and comply with the relevant regulatory framework. The correct approach involves proactively seeking guidance and ensuring all actions are transparent and documented, aligning with the principles of good corporate governance and regulatory compliance. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape governing HELA operations. Specifically, this approach aligns with the spirit and letter of regulations designed to prevent market manipulation and ensure fair dealings within the industry. It prioritizes adherence to established protocols and seeks to mitigate any potential risks before they materialize. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding without seeking clarification or approval risks violating regulatory requirements. Such an action could be interpreted as a disregard for established compliance procedures and potentially lead to accusations of unfair business practices. This failure to consult relevant authorities or internal compliance departments represents a significant ethical lapse and a direct contravention of the proactive compliance expected of employees. Another incorrect approach, which is to assume that the proposed action is permissible without due diligence, is equally problematic. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the complexities of regulatory compliance and the potential for unintended consequences. It can lead to actions that, while not explicitly forbidden, may fall into a gray area that regulators scrutinize closely, thereby exposing HELA to reputational damage and potential penalties. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear framework. First, identify any potential ethical or regulatory concerns. Second, consult internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines. Third, if ambiguity or significant risk exists, seek advice from the compliance department or legal counsel. Fourth, document all decisions and the rationale behind them. This systematic approach ensures that actions are not only compliant but also defensible and aligned with the company's commitment to integrity. Question 4. Operational review demonstrates that HELA is looking to expedite its recruitment process for critical roles, potentially bypassing some standard background checks and verification procedures outlined in the HELA Hiring Assessment Test's regulatory framework to meet aggressive project timelines. Which approach best ensures HELA compliance with its stated hiring assessment guidelines? Option A. Prioritize adherence to all stipulated background checks and verification procedures as mandated by the HELA Hiring Assessment Test's regulatory framework, even if it means adjusting project timelines. Option B. Implement a streamlined verification process that relies on self-attestation for most candidate information to accelerate hiring. Option C. Delegate the decision-making authority for waiving specific verification steps to individual hiring managers based on their assessment of candidate urgency. Option D. Focus solely on the technical skills assessment component of the HELA Hiring Assessment Test, considering other verification steps as secondary. The correct answer is A. Prioritize adherence to all stipulated background checks and verification procedures as mandated by the HELA Hiring Assessment Test's regulatory framework, even if it means adjusting project timelines. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for rapid market entry and the stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. HELA, as a publicly listed entity, must navigate these requirements meticulously. The challenge lies in balancing business objectives with legal and ethical obligations, ensuring that all actions taken are compliant and uphold the trust placed in the company by its stakeholders. Careful judgment is required to identify and mitigate potential regulatory breaches before they occur. The correct approach involves proactively seeking and adhering to the specific guidance provided by the HELA Hiring Assessment Test's regulatory framework. This means understanding the nuances of the applicable laws and guidelines that govern hiring practices within HELA operational jurisdiction. By prioritizing compliance and seeking expert advice when necessary, HELA demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence, thereby safeguarding its reputation and avoiding potential penalties. This approach aligns with the principle of know your obligations and the duty of care expected of a responsible corporate entity. An incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over regulatory diligence would fail to adequately assess the compliance implications of the hiring process. This could lead to unintentional breaches of regulations, such as those pertaining to fair hiring practices, data privacy, or background checks, depending on the specific jurisdiction's laws. Another incorrect approach, which relies on assumptions or outdated practices, ignores the dynamic nature of regulatory landscapes and the specific requirements of the HELA Hiring Assessment Test. This can result in non-compliance, reputational damage, and legal repercussions. A third incorrect approach, which delegates responsibility without ensuring oversight, creates a significant risk of regulatory noncompliance, as accountability for adherence to the HELA hiring assessment tests framework is diluted. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework for the HELA hiring assessment test. This involves identifying all applicable laws, regulations, and internal guidelines. Next, they should assess the specific hiring scenario against these requirements, identifying any potential areas of conflict or ambiguity. If uncertainty exists, seeking clarification from legal counsel or compliance officers is paramount. Finally, all decisions and actions should be documented to demonstrate due diligence and adherence to the established framework. Question 5. Operational review demonstrates that HELA current hiring assessment process for client-facing roles may not fully align with the specific regulatory framework and guidelines stipulated for the HELA hiring assessment test. Which of the following approaches best addresses this potential misalignment to ensure compliance and uphold client interests? Option A. Prioritize a rapid overhaul of the assessment process to reduce time to hire, focusing on efficiency gains without a detailed examination of the HELA hiring assessment test's specific regulatory stipulations. Option B. Conduct a thorough comparative analysis of HELA existing assessment procedures against the detailed requirements and objectives outlined in the HELA hiring assessment test's regulatory framework, identifying and rectifying any deviations to ensure full adherence. Option C. Implement a generalized review of HELA hiring practices based on common industry standards for financial services recruitment, assuming these will cover the specific needs of the HELA hiring assessment test. Option D. Rely on the discretion of HR and hiring managers to interpret and apply the HELA hiring assessment test's regulatory framework as they deem appropriate during the assessment process. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough comparative analysis of HELA existing assessment procedures against the detailed requirements and objectives outlined in the HELA hiring assessment test's regulatory framework, identifying and rectifying any deviations to ensure full adherence. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between operational efficiency and the stringent regulatory requirements governing financial advice and client suitability. HELA, as a financial services firm, must navigate these demands while ensuring client interests are paramount. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need to streamline processes to reduce costs and improve service delivery with the non-negotiable obligation to conduct thorough due diligence and provide advice that is genuinely in the client's best interest, as mandated by regulatory frameworks. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive review of HELA internal processes against the specific requirements of the HELA hiring assessment test regulatory framework. This means not just identifying potential conflicts, but actively seeking to understand the nuances of the regulations and how they apply to the assessment design. The justification for this approach is rooted in the principle of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. By aligning the assessment directly with the specified regulatory framework, HELA demonstrates a commitment to upholding legal standards and ensuring that its hiring practices do not inadvertently lead to the recruitment of individuals who may not be equipped to meet regulatory obligations or act in clients' best interests. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of future compliance breaches and reputational damage. An incorrect approach would be to assume that general best practices in hiring are sufficient without specific reference to the HELA hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. This fails to acknowledge the unique and potentially specific requirements of the assessment, which may go beyond standard industry norms. The regulatory failure here is a lack of due diligence in understanding the precise legal and ethical obligations tied to the assessment itself. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize speed and cost-effectiveness in the review process over thoroughness. This could lead to overlooking critical regulatory nuances or potential compliance gaps within the assessment. The ethical failure lies in potentially compromising the integrity of the hiring process, and by extension, the firm's ability to serve clients compliantly, all for the sake of expediency. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the specific regulatory jurisdiction and the exact requirements of the HELA hiring assessment test. This involves dissecting the assessment's objectives and identifying any explicit or implicit regulatory obligations it is designed to test. The next step is to compare Hella current processes against these identified requirements, looking for alignment and discrepancies. Where discrepancies exist, the focus should be on developing solutions that not only address the immediate issue, but also reinforce a culture of compliance and ethical conduct, ensuring that any changes are sustainable and robust. Question 6. Examination of the data shows that Hella is considering a new strategic initiative that requires analyzing customer purchasing patterns and internal sales figures. To gain the most granular insights, the initial proposal suggests accessing and analyzing the complete, raw datasets, including all personally identifiable customer information and proprietary sales details, without any prior anonymization or aggregation. What is the most appropriate approach for Hella to undertake this analysis, considering its regulatory obligations? Option A. Share the raw, identifiable customer and sales data informally with a small, trusted internal team for analysis without formal documentation. Option B. Discard all customer and sales data that contains any potentially sensitive information, even if it could be anonymized, to ensure absolute compliance. Option C. Access and analyze the raw, identifiable customer and sales data directly, as this provides the most comprehensive insights for strategic decision-making. Option D. Analyze anonymized or aggregated versions of the customer and sales data to identify trends and patterns. The correct answer is D. Analyze anonymized or aggregated versions of the customer and sales data to identify trends and patterns. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Hella, as a company operating within a regulated industry, must ensure its internal data handling practices align with all applicable laws and guidelines. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need for efficient data analysis to inform business decisions with the imperative to protect sensitive information and comply with regulatory mandates. A failure to do so could result in significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and loss of trust from stakeholders. Careful judgment is required to identify the most appropriate method for data analysis that respects these constraints. The correct approach involves utilizing anonymized or aggregated data for analysis. This method is professionally sound because it directly addresses the regulatory requirement to protect personal or commercially sensitive information while still allowing for meaningful insights. By removing or obscuring identifying details, Hella can conduct its analysis without violating privacy laws or breaching confidentiality agreements. This aligns with the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation often found in data protection regulations, ensuring that data is processed only to the extent necessary for a specific, legitimate purpose. An incorrect approach that involves analyzing raw, identifiable data without proper authorization or safeguards is professionally unacceptable. This directly violates data protection regulations, which typically mandate consent, legitimate basis for processing, and robust security measures for personal data. Another incorrect approach, which is to discard all data that could potentially be sensitive, even if anonymized, is also professionally unsound. While cautious, this approach hinders Hella ability to gain valuable insights from its data, potentially leading to missed business opportunities and a competitive disadvantage. It fails to strike the necessary balance between compliance and operational effectiveness. A third incorrect approach, which is to rely solely on informal, undocumented data sharing methods, is ethically and regulatorily problematic. This lacks transparency, accountability, and proper oversight, increasing the risk of data breaches and noncompliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the specific regulatory landscape governing Hella operations. This involves identifying the types of data being handled, the potential risks associated with that data, and the specific legal and ethical obligations. The next step is to evaluate different data analysis methodologies against these requirements, always favoring approaches that minimize risk and maximize compliance. Seeking guidance from legal and compliance departments is crucial when in doubt. The ultimate goal is to implement data practices that are both effective for business objectives and fully compliant with all relevant regulations. Question 7. Assessment of how a Hella procurement manager should ethically and compliantly manage a situation where their close personal friend is a key stakeholder in a supplier company bidding for a significant Hella contract, and the manager is involved in the evaluation and selection process for that contract. Option A. Resign from Hella immediately to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Option B. Continue to participate in the procurement process as usual, assuming personal objectivity will prevail. Option C. Subtly steer the evaluation towards the friend's company, believing it will lead to a mutually beneficial outcome. Option D. Proactively disclose the personal relationship to HELA Compliance Department and seek guidance on recusal or other conflict management measures. The correct answer is D. Proactively disclose the personal relationship to HELA Compliance Department and seek guidance on recusal or other conflict management measures. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a HELA employee due to the potential for conflicts of interest and the need to uphold the company's reputation and compliance standards. The core difficulty lies in balancing personal relationships with professional obligations and ensuring that decisions are made impartially and in the best interest of HELA, adhering strictly to its internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks. Careful judgment is required to identify and manage situations where personal interests could improperly influence business decisions. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent disclosure of the relationship to HELA Compliance Department or designated authority. This demonstrates adherence to HELA Code of Conduct and ethical guidelines, which typically mandate reporting of potential conflicts of interest. By disclosing, the employee allows HELA to implement appropriate measures, such as recusal from specific decision-making processes or oversight, thereby safeguarding the integrity of business operations and preventing any perception of favoritism or impropriety. This aligns with the principle of maintaining a professional environment free from undue influence. An incorrect approach of continuing to participate in the procurement process without disclosure is professionally unacceptable. This failure constitutes a breach of HELA internal policies on conflicts of interest and potentially violates ethical standards by creating an environment where decisions might be perceived as biased. It undermines trust within the organization and with external partners. Another incorrect approach of subtly influencing the decision-making process to favor the friend's company, even without explicit financial gain, is also a serious ethical and regulatory failure. This action directly contravenes the expectation of impartiality and fair dealing, potentially leading to suboptimal business outcomes for HELA and damaging its reputation for integrity. It can also expose HELA to regulatory scrutiny if such practices are found to be systemic. A further incorrect approach of resigning from HELA to avoid the conflict is an overreaction that does not address the underlying issue of conflict management. While it removes the individual from the immediate situation, it fails to uphold professional responsibility to manage conflicts transparently and ethically within the organization. It also deprives HELA of the employee's skills and contributions without a proper resolution. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of HELA policies on conflicts of interest and ethical conduct. When a potential conflict arises, the employee should first identify the nature of the relationship and the potential for influence. The next step is to consult HELA internal guidelines or compliance officer for direction. Transparency and proactive disclosure are paramount. If a decision must be made, the employee should consider recusing themselves from any part of the process where their impartiality could be questioned. The ultimate goal is to protect HELA interests and maintain its reputation for ethical business practices. Question 8. Which approach would be most professionally appropriate for a HELA employee who discovers that a close personal friend is a key stakeholder in a supplier company that HELA is currently evaluating for a significant contract, and the employee has some influence in the evaluation process? Option A. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to their direct supervisor and the relevant procurement department, offering to recuse themselves from any part of the supplier evaluation process that could be influenced by their personal connection. Option B. Inform the friend about HELA evaluation process and potential decision criteria so the friend's company can better tailor their proposal while still not formally disclosing the relationship to HELA. Option C. Proceed with the supplier evaluation as normal, assuming their professional judgment is not compromised by the personal friendship, and avoid mentioning the relationship to anyone at HELA. Option D. Discreetly try to steer the evaluation towards the friend's company, believing it would be a positive outcome for both HELA and their friend, without formally disclosing the relationship. Correct answer is A. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to their direct supervisor and the relevant procurement department, offering to recuse themselves from any part of the supplier evaluation process that could be influenced by their personal connection. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge for a HELA employee due to the potential for conflicts of interest and the need to uphold the company's ethical standards and regulatory compliance. The employee must navigate a situation where personal relationships could influence business decisions, potentially leading to unfair advantages or breaches of trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions align with HELA internal policies and relevant industry regulations, safeguarding the company's reputation and integrity. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent disclosure of the personal relationship to the relevant internal authority at HELA. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and adherence to corporate governance principles. By informing HELA, the employee allows the company to implement appropriate safeguards, such as recusal from decision-making processes or enhanced oversight, thereby mitigating any potential conflicts of interest. This aligns with the general principles of corporate ethics and the need for employees to act in the best interest of the company, as typically outlined in employee handbooks and codes of conduct, which are designed to prevent situations where personal interests could compromise professional judgment. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the business dealings without disclosing the relationship. This failure to disclose is a direct breach of ethical obligations and potentially company policy, as it conceals information that could impact impartiality. It creates an environment where decisions might be perceived as biased, undermining trust among colleagues and stakeholders. Furthermore, depending on the specific industry and regulatory environment HELA operates within, such a failure could lead to violations of regulations concerning fair competition, anti-corruption, or insider trading, resulting in significant legal and financial repercussions for both the employee and HELA. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to subtly influence the decision-making process in favor of the acquaintance, even without explicit disclosure. This is ethically reprehensible and professionally damaging. It represents a deliberate misuse of one's position for personal gain or to benefit a friend, which is a direct violation of the duty of loyalty owed to HELA. Such actions erode the integrity of business processes and can lead to severe disciplinary action, including termination and potential legal consequences if it results in financial harm to the company or its partners. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of HELA Code of Conduct and conflict of interest policies. When a potential conflict arises, the employee should first identify the nature of the relationship and the potential impact on business decisions. The next step is to consult HELA internal guidelines or speak with a supervisor or HR department to understand the reporting requirements. Transparency and proactive communication are paramount. If a conflict is identified, the employee should offer to recuse themselves from any decision-making processes directly related to the situation. This structured approach ensures that ethical standards are maintained and that HELA interests are protected. Question 9. Implementation of a new project at HELA requires an employee to use a specialized piece of company-owned testing equipment for a personal hobby project that is unrelated to their work duties. The employee believes the equipment will only be used for a short period and will not interfere with their work responsibilities. Option A. Proceed with using the company equipment for the personal project, assuming that minor, non-disruptive personal use of company assets is implicitly permitted. Option B. Use the company equipment for the personal project, but ensure it is returned promptly and kept confidential to avoid any potential issues. Option C. Purchase similar equipment for personal use to avoid any complications with company property. Option D. Immediately report the potential use of company equipment for a personal project to their supervisor and seek explicit written approval, outlining the nature of the project and the duration of equipment use. The correct answer is A. Proceed with using the company equipment for the personal project, assuming that minor, non-disruptive personal use of company assets is implicitly permitted. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge for HELA employees regarding the ethical and regulatory implications of using company resources for personal gain, even if seemingly minor. The core difficulty lies in balancing individual needs with corporate policy and regulatory compliance, requiring careful judgment to avoid conflicts of interest and maintain professional integrity. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to HELA established policies on the use of company property and resources. This aligns with regulatory expectations for corporate governance and ethical conduct. which mandate that employees act in the best interests of the company and avoid situations that could compromise their objectivity or create a perception of impropriety. By reporting the potential use of company equipment for personal benefit and seeking clarification, an employee demonstrates a commitment to transparency and compliance, safeguarding both themselves and HELA from potential regulatory scrutiny or reputational damage. An incorrect approach that involves using company equipment for personal projects without explicit authorization is professionally unacceptable. This action directly violates corporate policies designed to prevent misuse of assets and potential conflicts of interest. It can lead to disciplinary action, damage trust within the organization, and in more serious cases, expose HELA to legal or regulatory repercussions if the use of equipment is deemed unauthorized or infringes on intellectual property rights. Another incorrect approach, which is to assume that minor personal use is acceptable without checking policy, is also flawed. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and an underestimation of the importance of corporate guidelines. Regulatory frameworks often emphasize a proactive approach to compliance, where employees are expected to understand and follow established rules rather than making assumptions. This can lead to unintentional breaches of policy and create a precedent for further noncompliance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of HELA code of conduct and relevant policies. When faced with a situation where personal and professional interests might intersect, or where the use of company resources is contemplated for non-business purposes, the employee should 1. Consult HELA official policies and guidelines. 2. If ambiguity exists, seek clarification from their direct supervisor or the relevant department, e.g., HR, legal. 3. Prioritize company interests and ethical conduct over personal convenience. 4. Document any approvals or guidance received. Question 10. Operational review demonstrates that a senior executive at HELA has recommended a new potential supplier for a critical component, citing a long-standing personal relationship with the supplier's CEO. This new supplier offers a potentially lower price point, but has not undergone HELA's standard vendor qualification process. The current supplier has a proven track record and a strong existing relationship with HELA procurement team. Considering HELA commitment to ethical sourcing and robust supply chain management, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Initiate a formal, objective evaluation of the new supplier, comparing their offerings against HELA-established criteria and current supplier performance, while ensuring all internal procurement policies and ethical guidelines are strictly followed. Option B. Immediately approve the new supplier based on the senior executive's recommendation to foster goodwill and potentially secure cost savings, bypassing the standard qualification process. Option C. Delegate the decision solely to the senior executive who made the recommendation, trusting their judgment and personal relationship to ensure a suitable outcome for HELA. Option D. Reject the new supplier outright to maintain the stability of the existing, reliable supply chain and avoid any perceived disruption or favoritism towards new entrants. The correct answer is A. Initiate a formal, objective evaluation of the new supplier, comparing their offerings against HELA-established criteria and current supplier performance, while ensuring all internal procurement policies and ethical guidelines are strictly followed. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires HELA to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure fair treatment of all stakeholders when considering a new supplier. The core challenge lies in balancing the desire for efficiency and cost savings with the ethical obligation to avoid favoritism and maintain transparency. Careful judgment is required to prevent even the appearance of impropriety, which could damage HELA reputation and trust with its existing partners. The correct approach involves a structured and objective evaluation process that prioritizes HELA-established procurement policies and regulatory compliance. This approach is right because it upholds the principles of fairness, transparency, and accountability mandated by typical corporate governance frameworks and procurement regulations. Specifically, it ensures that supplier selection is based on merit, such as quality, reliability, and cost-effectiveness, rather than personal relationships or undue influence. This aligns with the ethical duty to act in the best interests of the company and its shareholders, and to comply with any relevant anti-bribery and corruption laws that prohibit preferential treatment based on non-business considerations. An incorrect approach that involves immediately approving the new supplier based on the personal recommendation of a senior executive without a formal evaluation, fails to adhere to established procurement procedures. This creates a significant risk of bias and could violate internal policies designed to prevent conflicts of interest. It also bypasses the necessary due diligence, potentially exposing HELA to risks associated with an unvetted supplier, such as quality issues or supply chain disruptions. Another incorrect approach, which is to reject the new supplier outright due to the existing relationship with the current supplier, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of objectivity and a failure to explore potentially beneficial opportunities for HELA. It could stifle innovation and lead to suboptimal procurement decisions by prematurely closing off avenues for improvement. This approach also risks alienating the senior executive who made the recommendation and could be perceived as resistant to change or new ideas. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a commitment to following established policies and procedures. When presented with a new opportunity or recommendation, professionals should first assess if it aligns with existing company guidelines. If a potential conflict of interest or a deviation from standard practice is identified, the next step is to escalate the matter for appropriate review and approval, ensuring all relevant parties are informed and that a transparent, documented decision-making process is followed. The focus should always be on achieving the best outcome for the company through objective, evidence-based decision-making, while rigorously adhering to ethical standards and regulatory requirements. Question 11. During the evaluation of a new potential supplier for HELA, you discover that the primary contact at the supplier company is a close personal friend of a senior executive within HELA procurement department. This relationship was not disclosed by the executive. You are concerned about the potential for a conflict of interest and its implications for HELA procurement policies and ethical standards. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Discreetly investigate the nature and extent of the relationship to determine if it truly constitutes a conflict before reporting it. Option B. Proceed with the supplier evaluation as planned, assuming the relationship will not influence the decision-making process. Option C. Advise the senior executive to disclose their relationship to HELA compliance department and then continue with the evaluation. Option D. Immediately report the potential conflict of interest to HELA compliance department and request guidance on how to proceed with the supplier evaluation. The correct answer is D. Immediately report the potential conflict of interest to HELA compliance department and request guidance on how to proceed with the supplier evaluation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with the long-term ethical and regulatory obligations of HELA. The pressure to meet targets can create a temptation to overlook or downplay potential compliance issues. Careful judgment is required to ensure that short-term gains do not lead to significant long-term reputational damage or legal repercussions. The correct approach involves proactively identifying and addressing the potential conflict of interest and seeking guidance from the appropriate internal compliance or legal department. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence, which are paramount in the automotive supply industry. Specifically, by escalating the issue, the employee upholds HELA commitment to fair competition and avoids any appearance of impropriety. This aligns with general principles of corporate governance and ethical business practices, which are often codified in company policies and industry standards. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the supplier relationship without disclosing the potential conflict. This could lead to accusations of favoritism, unfair business practices, and a breach of trust with other suppliers and stakeholders. It also exposes HELA to regulatory scrutiny and potential penalties if the relationship is found to be non-compliant with anti-corruption or fair trading laws. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the potential conflict and hope it goes unnoticed. This passive stance is irresponsible and fails to address the ethical and regulatory risks, potentially leading to more severe consequences when discovered. Finally, attempting to resolve the conflict independently without consulting relevant departments could result in an inadequate or inappropriate resolution, further jeopardizing HELA compliance posture. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance. This involves recognizing potential conflicts of interest, understanding the relevant company policies and external regulations, and seeking advice from designated compliance or legal resources when in doubt. The principle of when in doubt, escalate is a crucial element of professional integrity. Question 12. Stakeholder feedback indicates that a senior executive at Hella is requesting access to preliminary non-public financial performance data for a specific division before its official release, stating it is for strategic planning purposes and to prepare for investor questions. As a compliance officer, how should you respond to this request? Option A. Provide the requested data, but instruct the executive to use it only for internal strategic planning and not to share it externally. Option B. Attempt to subtly guide the executive's strategic planning based on your knowledge of the upcoming data without directly sharing the figures. Option C. Ignore the request, assuming the executive will understand the limitations without explicit communication. Option D. Politely decline the request, explaining that sharing non-public pre-release financial data is prohibited by Hella internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines designed to ensure fair market access and prevent insider trading. The correct answer is D. Politely decline the request, explaining that sharing non-public pre-release financial data is prohibited by Hella internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines designed to ensure fair market access and prevent insider trading. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a conflict between a direct request from a senior stakeholder and the established ethical guidelines and regulatory requirements governing financial advice. The pressure to comply with a direct request, especially from someone in a position of authority, can create a difficult ethical dilemma. It requires an individual to balance their professional integrity and adherence to regulations against potential personal or professional repercussions. Careful judgment is required to navigate this situation without compromising ethical standards or legal obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves politely but firmly declining the request, citing the relevant regulatory framework and ethical guidelines that prohibit such actions. This upholds professional integrity by prioritizing compliance and ethical conduct over immediate stakeholder satisfaction. Specifically, adherence to the Hella hiring assessment test's stipulated regulatory framework would mandate transparency and prohibit the sharing of non-public information that could be used for personal gain or to disadvantage other stakeholders. This approach demonstrates a commitment to fair dealing and preventing market abuse, which are fundamental principles in regulated environments. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that involves complying with the request, even with the intention of mitigating potential harm, is ethically and regulatorily unsound. This would constitute a breach of confidentiality and potentially insider trading regulations, depending on the nature of the information. It prioritizes a stakeholder's immediate desire over the broader regulatory and ethical obligations to all stakeholders and the market's integrity. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the request without any communication. This is professionally negligent as it fails to address the stakeholder's query and leaves the situation unresolved, potentially leading to further misunderstandings or attempts to circumvent proper channels. It also misses an opportunity to educate the stakeholder on regulatory boundaries. Finally, an approach that involves seeking to subtly influence the market based on the information, even without directly sharing it, is also problematic. This could be construed as market manipulation or an attempt to gain an unfair advantage, which is contrary to the principles of fair and orderly markets and would likely violate regulatory prohibitions against such behavior. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a dilemma should first identify the core conflict between the request and their professional obligations. They should then consult the relevant regulatory framework and internal company policies to understand the specific rules and ethical principles at play. The next step is to communicate clearly and respectfully with the stakeholder, explaining the limitations imposed by these regulations and ethical standards. If the stakeholder persists, escalating the issue to a supervisor or compliance department is crucial. The decision-making process should always prioritize adherence to the law and ethical principles, even when faced with pressure. Question 13. Performance analysis shows a consistent pattern of Hella European Sales Division reporting slightly below target figures for the past 2 quarters, while simultaneously, anecdotal evidence suggests a surge in demand for Hella products in that region. A senior manager in the sales division has proposed adjusting the reporting methodology for the current quarter to better reflect the perceived market reality and ensure targets are met. Citing competitive pressures. Option A. Accept the senior manager's proposal to adjust the reporting methodology for the current quarter to meet targets, as it reflects the perceived market demand and competitive pressures. Option B. Instruct the sales team to focus solely on future sales efforts and disregard the past reporting discrepancies, assuming they are minor and will naturally correct themselves. Option C. Publicly acknowledge the performance shortfall and explain that market conditions are challenging, without further investigation into the reporting methodology. Option D. Initiate a formal internal investigation into the sales reporting discrepancies and the proposed adjustment, involving the finance and compliance departments, to determine the root cause and ensure accurate reporting in accordance with HELA policies and relevant regulations. The correct answer is D. Initiate a formal internal investigation into the sales reporting discrepancies and the proposed adjustment, involving the finance and compliance departments, to determine the root cause and ensure accurate reporting in accordance with HELA policies and relevant regulations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with the long-term implications of ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. The pressure to meet performance targets can create a temptation to overlook or downplay potential issues, but doing so can lead to severe reputational damage, legal penalties, and a breakdown of trust with stakeholders. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions align with HELA ethical standards and relevant regulatory frameworks. The correct approach involves proactively addressing the identified performance discrepancies by initiating a thorough internal investigation. This demonstrates a commitment to transparency, accountability, and adherence to regulatory requirements. By investigating the root cause of the underperformance and potential misreporting, HELA can take corrective actions, ensure accurate financial reporting, and prevent future occurrences. This aligns with the ethical principle of integrity and the regulatory obligation to maintain accurate records and prevent fraudulent activities. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the performance analysis or to attempt to manipulate the data to meet targets. This would constitute a failure to uphold ethical standards of honesty and transparency. It could also lead to violations of financial reporting regulations, such as those requiring accurate disclosure of financial performance. Another incorrect approach would be to address the issue superficially without a proper investigation, such as simply reassigning blame without understanding the underlying causes. This would fail to rectify the problem and could perpetuate unethical practices. Professionals facing similar situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Recognizing and acknowledging the issue. 2. Seeking to understand the full scope and potential implications. 3. Consulting relevant internal policies and external regulations. 4. Escalating the issue to appropriate internal stakeholders or legal counsel if necessary. 5. Taking decisive and transparent action to address the root cause and prevent recurrence, even if it presents short-term challenges. Question 14. Compliance review shows that critical data submission for HELA quarterly performance report is due tomorrow. You have identified a minor but persistent discrepancy between two internal data sources that, if left unaddressed, will result in a slightly inaccurate final figure. Your manager is emphasizing the importance of meeting the deadline without fail. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Submit the report with the discrepancy, assuming it is minor enough not to cause significant issues and prioritizing the deadline. Option B. Attempt to manually adjust one of the data sources to align with the other, ensuring the final figure appears consistent. Option C. Immediately flag the discrepancy to your manager and request guidance on how to proceed, even if it means a potential slight delay in submission to ensure accuracy. Option D. Ignore the discrepancy, hoping that it will not be noticed during the review process. The correct answer is A. Submit the report with the discrepancy, assuming it is minor enough not to cause significant issues and prioritizing the deadline. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate operational needs with the ethical obligation to maintain data integrity and comply with regulatory reporting requirements. The pressure to meet deadlines can tempt individuals to cut corners, but doing so can have severe consequences. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions align with HELA internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks, even under pressure. The correct approach involves prioritizing accurate data collection and reporting, even if it means a slight delay. This aligns with the fundamental ethical principle of honesty and integrity in financial reporting and data management. Specifically, it adheres to the spirit and letter of regulations that mandate truthful and accurate disclosures. By flagging the discrepancy and seeking clarification, the employee demonstrates a commitment to compliance and prevents the submission of potentially misleading information. This proactive stance protects Hella from regulatory penalties and reputational damage. An incorrect approach that involves submitting the data without addressing the discrepancy is professionally unacceptable. This action directly violates the ethical duty to report accurately and truthfully. It could lead to regulatory sanctions for misrepresentation or fraud, and severely damage Hella credibility with stakeholders and regulatory bodies. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the discrepancy and hope it goes unnoticed, is equally problematic. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for compliance responsibilities. It creates a risk of future discovery, which could be even more damaging than an immediate correction. A third incorrect approach, which is to alter the data to fit the expected outcome, is a clear ethical and regulatory breach. This constitutes data manipulation and can be considered fraudulent. It undermines the entire purpose of data collection and reporting, which is to provide a true and fair view of operations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the ethical and regulatory implications of the situation. 2. Seeking clarification or guidance when faced with uncertainty or discrepancies. 3. Documenting all actions and communications. 4. Escalating issues to appropriate channels if resolution cannot be achieved independently. The goal is always to uphold the highest standards of integrity, even when faced with operational pressures. Question 15. Compliance review shows that a recent sales initiative at Hella may have inadvertently led to practices that could be interpreted as misleading to potential clients regarding product specifications. While the sales team believes they are within acceptable boundaries to meet targets, the compliance department has flagged this as a potential area of concern. What is the most appropriate course of action for a Hella employee who becomes aware of this situation? Option A. Continue with the current sales practices, assuming the sales team's interpretation is correct, and wait for a formal directive from management. Option B. Focus solely on meeting sales targets and leave any compliance-related issues to be handled by the dedicated compliance team without direct involvement. Option C. Immediately escalate the concern to the Hella Compliance Department and offer full cooperation in investigating and rectifying the situation. Option D. Discreetly adjust sales materials to subtly align with compliance concerns without formally reporting the issue. The correct answer is C. Immediately escalate the concern to the Hella Compliance Department and offer full cooperation in investigating and rectifying the situation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The pressure to meet targets can create a temptation to overlook or downplay potential compliance issues. Careful judgment is required to ensure that short-term gains do not lead to significant long-term reputational damage or legal penalties. The correct approach involves proactively addressing the identified compliance gap by initiating a thorough investigation and implementing corrective actions. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence, which are paramount for Hella's sustained success and reputation. Specifically, reporting the issue internally and collaborating with the compliance department to rectify the situation aligns with principles of good corporate governance and the spirit of regulatory frameworks designed to ensure fair and transparent business practices. This proactive stance mitigates risk and reinforces a culture of compliance. An incorrect approach of ignoring the discrepancy or attempting to obscure it would be a severe ethical and regulatory failure. This would violate principles of honesty and integrity, potentially leading to significant fines, legal action, and irreparable damage to Hella reputation. Another incorrect approach of only addressing the issue superficially without a genuine commitment to remediation would also be problematic. This would fail to address the root cause of the compliance gap, leaving Hella vulnerable to future violations and demonstrating a lack of genuine commitment to ethical operations. Professionals facing similar situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance above all else. This involves understanding the potential consequences of inaction or unethical behavior, seeking guidance from compliance and legal departments, and advocating for transparent and responsible business practices. A commitment to continuous learning and staying abreast of relevant regulations is also crucial. Question 16. Compliance review shows that a potential supplier for a major HELA contract has a history of questionable business practices that could raise concerns under anti-bribery regulations. The contract is crucial for HELA quarterly targets, and delaying it would have significant financial implications. Option A. Immediately raise the concerns internally with the compliance and legal departments to assess the risks and develop a plan to address the supplier's practices before finalizing the contract. Option B. Ignore the compliance review findings to avoid jeopardizing the contract and focus solely on meeting the quarterly financial targets. Option C. Proceed with the contract as planned, assuming the supplier's past issues will not impact HELA, and address any potential problems if they arise later. Option D. Inform the supplier of the concerns and demand immediate rectification of their practices as a condition of the contract, without further internal review. The correct answer is A. Immediately raise the concerns internally with the compliance and legal departments to assess the risks and develop a plan to address the supplier's practices before finalizing the contract. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The pressure to secure a significant contract can create a temptation to overlook or downplay potential ethical concerns. Careful judgment is required to ensure that HELA actions align with its stated values and legal responsibilities, even when faced with competitive pressures. The correct approach involves proactively addressing the identified compliance gap before finalizing the contract. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence. By raising the issue internally and seeking to rectify it, HELA prioritizes integrity and risk mitigation. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and responsible business practices, which are often implicitly or explicitly supported by regulatory frameworks that aim to prevent corruption and ensure fair competition. Specifically, if the HELA hiring assessment test is governed by UK regulations, this approach would align with the principles of the Bribery Act 2010, which emphasizes preventing bribery and promoting ethical business conduct. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the contract without addressing the compliance gap is professionally unacceptable. This action creates significant legal and reputational risks for HELA. It could be interpreted as a willful disregard for compliance, potentially leading to severe penalties, fines, and damage to the company's reputation. This would violate principles of due diligence and responsible corporate behavior. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the compliance issue and hope it goes unnoticed, is also professionally unsound. This passive stance does not absolve HELA of responsibility and leaves the company vulnerable to future discovery and repercussions. It undermines the effectiveness of internal compliance mechanisms and fosters a culture where ethical lapses can occur without consequence. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear escalation path for identified risks. When a potential compliance issue arises, the first step is to thoroughly investigate and understand the nature and extent of the risk. This should be followed by an internal discussion with relevant stakeholders, including legal and compliance departments. The decision-making framework should prioritize ethical considerations and regulatory requirements over short-term gains. If a risk cannot be adequately mitigated, the responsible course of action is to delay or withdraw from the engagement until compliance can be assured. Question 17. Strategic planning requires HELA to accurately assess its performance. During a review of recent project data, a junior analyst discovers a potential discrepancy that, if corrected, could significantly reduce the reported positive financial impact of a key initiative. The analyst is under pressure from their manager to finalize the report quickly to meet quarterly targets. What is the most ethical and professionally responsible course of action for the analyst? Option A. Proceed with reporting the positive financial impact as initially calculated, assuming the discrepancy is minor and will be resolved in future reporting cycles. Option B. Omit the data related to the discrepancy from the current report to avoid delaying the target achievement. Option C. Immediately report the discrepancy to their manager and request further investigation before finalizing the report, adhering to HELA internal data integrity policies. Option D. Inform the manager about the discrepancy, but proceed with the original report as requested to meet the deadline, noting the potential issue informally. Correct answer is C. Immediately report the discrepancy to their manager and request further investigation before finalizing the report, adhering to HELA internal data integrity policies. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical and regulatory obligations. The pressure to meet targets can lead to overlooking potential compliance issues, creating a conflict between performance and integrity. Careful judgment is required to navigate this conflict without compromising HELA reputation or legal standing. The correct approach involves prioritizing a thorough investigation and adherence to HELA internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks, even if it delays the immediate reporting of positive results. This demonstrates a commitment to accuracy, transparency, and compliance, which are fundamental ethical principles in business and are often codified in regulatory guidelines. By ensuring all data is verified and potential issues are addressed, HELA upholds its duty of care to stakeholders and maintains its license to operate. An incorrect approach that involves selectively reporting only the positive findings without full verification would be a failure of due diligence. This could lead to misrepresentation of financial performance, potentially violating accounting standards and securities regulations if HELA is a publicly traded entity. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the discrepancy and proceed with reporting, constitutes a breach of ethical conduct and could expose HELA to significant legal and financial penalties for noncompliance and potentially fraudulent reporting. A third incorrect approach, which is to immediately halt all reporting without a clear plan for resolution, while cautious, might be overly reactive and could damage investor confidence unnecessarily if the issue is minor and easily rectifiable. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a structured approach. First, identify the ethical and regulatory implications. Second, consult relevant internal policies and external regulations. Third, gather all necessary facts and evidence. Fourth, seek guidance from legal or compliance departments if uncertainty exists. And finally, act in a manner that upholds integrity and compliance, even if it presents short-term challenges. Question 18. Compliance review shows that a key supplier to HELA, which is crucial for an upcoming major contract, has been flagged for potential ethical breaches related to labor practices in its overseas manufacturing facilities. The contract is vital for HELA quarterly targets. Option A. Inform the supplier of the allegations and request an immediate internal audit, but continue with the contract preparations while awaiting their findings. Option B. Initiate a confidential, thorough investigation into the labor practice allegations, gathering all necessary evidence and consulting with HELA legal and compliance departments before making any decisions regarding the supplier or the contract. Option C. Immediately halt all dealings with the supplier and seek an alternative, regardless of the contract's importance, to avoid any association with potential misconduct. Option D. Proceed with the contract as planned, assuming the allegations are unsubstantiated, and address any confirmed issues only if they directly impact HELA operations or reputation. The correct answer is C. Immediately halt all dealings with the supplier and seek an alternative, regardless of the contract's importance, to avoid any association with potential misconduct. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The pressure to secure a significant contract can lead to overlooking potential ethical compromises. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions align with the HELA hiring assessment test specified regulatory framework, which likely emphasizes integrity, fairness, and transparency in business dealings. The correct approach involves a thorough and objective investigation into the allegations, adhering strictly to HELA internal policies and any relevant regulatory guidelines. This means gathering all pertinent facts, interviewing relevant parties without bias, and documenting the process meticulously. The regulatory justification lies in upholding principles of due diligence, preventing potential misconduct, and maintaining the company's reputation. Ethically, It demonstrates a commitment to fairness and accountability. An incorrect approach that involves dismissing the allegations without proper investigation is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for due diligence and a potential conflict of interest if the individual making the decision benefits from the contract proceeding without scrutiny. It violates ethical principles of fairness and accountability and could lead to regulatory breaches if the allegations are substantiated. Another incorrect approach, which is to immediately terminate the relationship with the supplier based on unverified claims, is also professionally unsound. While appearing decisive, it lacks the necessary due process and could result in legal repercussions for wrongful termination or breach of contract. It also fails to uphold the ethical principle of giving individuals or entities a fair opportunity to respond to accusations. The professional reasoning framework for such situations involves a structured, fact-based approach. First, acknowledge the seriousness of the compliance review findings. Second, initiate a formal, impartial investigation process guided by established company policies and relevant regulations. Third, ensure all findings are documented and reviewed by appropriate stakeholders, including legal and compliance departments. Finally, make a decision based on the evidence, adhering to ethical principles and regulatory requirements, prioritizing long-term integrity over short-term gains. Question 19. Investigation of a potential conflict of interest arises when a Hella employee discovers that a close personal friend is submitting a bid for a significant contract with Hella, and the employee has some insight into the internal evaluation criteria for such bids. Option A. Advise the friend on how to best tailor their bid to meet Hella evaluation criteria, leveraging personal knowledge. Option B. Assume the friend's bid will be evaluated fairly and take no action, as personal relationships should not interfere with professional processes. Option C. Report the situation immediately to Hella Compliance Department or designated ethics officer. Option D. Discreetly try to influence the evaluation committee to favor the friend's bid, citing the friend's capabilities. The correct answer is C. Report the situation immediately to Hella Compliance Department or designated ethics officer. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Hella employee due to the potential conflict between personal relationships and professional integrity, specifically concerning the procurement process. The need for careful judgment arises from the obligation to act in Hella best interest, free from undue influence or the appearance of impropriety. The correct approach involves reporting the situation to the appropriate internal channels, such as the compliance department or a designated ethics hotline. This is the right course of action because it adheres to Hella internal code of conduct and any relevant regulatory frameworks that mandate transparency and the avoidance of conflicts of interest in business dealings. By reporting, the employee ensures that Hella procurement decisions are made objectively, based on merit and value, rather than personal connections. This upholds the principles of fair competition and ethical business practices, which are fundamental to maintaining Hella reputation and legal standing. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the situation or to try and influence the procurement decision based on the personal relationship. Ignoring the situation fails to address a potential ethical breach and could lead to Hella making a suboptimal decision, potentially incurring financial losses or reputational damage. Attempting to influence the decision directly, even with good intentions, creates a clear conflict of interest. This violates ethical principles by prioritizing a personal relationship over Hella objective interests and could contravene regulations related to fair procurement and anti-corruption, depending on the specific jurisdiction's laws. Another incorrect approach would be to discuss the situation with the friend involved and try to steer the decision in their favor. This is ethically unsound, as it involves using insider knowledge of Hella processes for personal gain or to benefit a friend, undermining the integrity of the procurement process and potentially violating confidentiality obligations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of Hella ethical policies and any applicable external regulations. When faced with a potential conflict of interest, the first step is to identify the conflict. The next step is to consult Hella Code of Conduct or relevant policies to understand the prescribed reporting mechanisms. If a conflict is identified, the professional obligation is to disclose it through the appropriate channels, allowing Hella to manage the situation impartially and in accordance with its ethical and legal obligations. Question 20. The efficiency study reveals potential cost savings for Hella, but the data collection process was interrupted by an unexpected system outage, meaning the results are preliminary and may not fully represent the operational reality. How should the findings be presented to senior management? Option A. Report the preliminary findings, clearly stating the limitations due to the system outage and recommending further data collection for validation before definitive conclusions are drawn. Option B. Selectively present only the most favorable preliminary data points that suggest cost savings, while omitting any data that indicates otherwise or highlights the incompleteness. Option C. Present the preliminary findings as conclusive evidence of cost savings, highlighting the positive aspects to demonstrate the study's success. Option D. Delay the report until a complete and perfect dataset can be obtained, even if this significantly postpones the decision-making process. The correct answer is C. Present the preliminary findings as conclusive evidence of cost savings, highlighting the positive aspects to demonstrate the study's success. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's pursuit of efficiency and cost reduction with the ethical obligation to maintain data integrity and avoid misleading stakeholders. The pressure to present favorable results, even if based on incomplete or potentially flawed data, can create a conflict of interest. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any reporting of efficiency gains is accurate, transparent, and compliant with relevant professional standards and any applicable HELA-specific internal guidelines or codes of conduct. The correct approach involves acknowledging the limitations of the data and ensuring that any reported efficiency gains are qualified by these limitations. This demonstrates a commitment to accuracy and transparency, which are fundamental ethical principles in professional reporting. By clearly stating that the study's findings are preliminary and subject to further validation, HELA upholds its responsibility to provide truthful information to its stakeholders, preventing potential misinterpretations or decisions based on incomplete data. This aligns with general principles of professional integrity and responsible business conduct. An incorrect approach of presenting the preliminary findings as conclusive results would be ethically flawed because it misrepresents the certainty of the data. This could lead to incorrect strategic decisions by management or misinformed perceptions by investors or other stakeholders. Another incorrect approach of delaying the report indefinitely to achieve perfect data, while seemingly cautious, could also be problematic if it hinders necessary business decisions or creates an undue burden on resources without a clear benefit. The ethical failure here lies in potentially obstructing legitimate business processes through excessive, uncommunicated caution. Finally, an approach that selectively highlights only the positive preliminary findings, while omitting or downplaying the data limitations, would be a clear breach of professional ethics, constituting a form of data manipulation or misrepresentation. This deliberately creates a misleading picture, undermining trust and accountability. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the core ethical obligations, such as honesty, accuracy, and transparency. They should then assess the potential impact of different courses of action on stakeholders. A structured decision-making process would involve 1. Understanding the data's limitations. 2. Consulting relevant internal policies or codes of conduct. 3. Considering the purpose of the report and its intended audience. 4. Exploring options for presenting the information transparently, perhaps with caveats or recommendations for further investigation. And 5. Seeking guidance from supervisors or ethics committees if the situation is complex or uncertain.